that you hadn't been punished enough, you then get a call from Boris Johnson when he takes the reins in 2019 to be sent to here, to Northern Ireland. Was that a call that you had expected to get? Do you remember where you were when you picked up the phone?
So I think I was in the pub. I had been, I'd left the whip's office, and that presumed that might be over, and that might be my cabinet career over. But I was very pleased. I wasn't expecting it. I'd hoped that it would be possible to stay in cabinet, but it was a great, it was a great moment.
So I've heard you talk about this before with Mark Carruthers about being in the pub. I suppose, I mean, did you tell Boris Johnson when you walked into his office that you had been in the pub? Is that a conversation that happens?
I don't think it's ever sensible to talk about conversations that one has with the Prime Minister, but I made clear, and probably it was clear, where I had been.
Right, okay, so, all right, not bad. No, okay. Speaking as honestly as you can, Julian, I wonder, did you know in detail that much about Northern Ireland when you got the call?
Well, I'd managed the relationship with the DUP as government chief whip, so I had a pretty good understanding of the issues. We'd obviously, as chief whip, I'd been involved with the Governance Act that was there after the Buick case to give civil servants in Northern Ireland some direction, and that obviously had got amended to include both the victims' pension, same-sex marriage, and also the abortion reform processes. So yeah, I did, and I think that was probably what made that job, or that discussion with the Prime Minister so positive. It was a part of the country I'd got to know.
Well, let me ask then, you mentioned the confidence and supply agreement. You'd worked closely with the DUP, like you say. You even spoke fairly effusively at their party conference in 2017. And then add onto that you are yourself a strong unionist. Is it really possible, was it really possible for you or people like you to be an honest broker under the conditions of the Good Friday Agreement? Is it really possible for a Conservative Secretary of State in any form to be an honest broker in Northern Ireland?
Well, I think I showed multiple times doing that role that I was not biased, certainly towards any party, and called the DUP out on a number of occasions to their irritation, as I did with other parties. So I think, that's on record, and I feel that I was pretty even-handed.
Did you talk to Karen Bradley at all before you started? You'd taken over immediately after her time here. Did you have a conversation with her?
You talk to most of your predecessors in it, when you enter these jobs. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And did she give you any advice that proved to be particularly helpful?
Well, I think, again, I don't really want to go into conversations I have with colleagues, but you talk to colleagues and you make sure that you're getting as much knowledge as you can. One of the things about politics is you have people moving in and out, and obviously just making sure that you're understanding from predecessors, their experience is important, as in Northern Ireland, and to be honest, it was in speaking to the opposition. And I think Northern Ireland, certainly one of the very positive periods of elements of that period was Tony, who was the opposition spokesman. There was a good relationship there.
Do you have a recollection particularly of the first time you flew to Northern Ireland as Secretary of State? Do you remember what your first briefing was like? Did it set you at ease, or did it really highlight the enormity of the challenge that you were facing?
Well, I think those early days were really marked by, a sense that a status on the talks, and the fact that that Stormont still wasn't working after a lot of time. And I'd obviously seen what Karen had as chief whip. There'd been various attempts to bring legislation, and to try to get Stormont going, and I'd seen how frustrating that could be. But it was also in that period, concerning around the run up to Brexit. If you remember, it was the end of October, and there were real worries about no deal. And I think I was struck from those first hours by the fact that no deal was not a position we wanted to be in. So I think that twin track approach of Stormont, needing to try and get that up and running before we exited the EU at the end of October, and also doing everything I could to avoid no deal.
Mm-hmm. And a couple of questions are submitted specifically about yourself and no deal. A really simple question was sent in by Keir, which just says, why did you succeed in Northern Ireland where your predecessors had failed? What's your diagnosis of why you were successful and others weren't?
Well, I don't think that's for me to judge. I think that what I would say is a lot of effort was put in by a lot of people before, both political, so my predecessors as Secretary of State, but also civil servants and others, on restoring Stormont and on dealing with many other issues. You've got to be honest. Some of it is around timing. Some issues I was able to resolve that hadn't been resolved in predecessors' time. Some issues, still remain unresolved when I left. So some is timing, and some is circumstance and different approaches. But I don't think I should be judging my own homework on that.
Well, with respect, I think everybody judges your homework, and the proof's in the pudding, which was that there was a deal at the end of that period of time in which you were in office. I wonder what was the key for you? What were the key issues that fell in your favour? Some down to luck, and I'm sure some down to your own gifts. What were those issues, and how did they fall in your favour in such a way that you were able to get a deal in place?
Well, I think the biggest thing was that for whatever reason, and again, there will have been timing issues, contextual issues, things like, as it got to the issue of, the final weeks of the deal, post-election issues, but just generally through that period, I was very grateful for the trust that both citizens in Northern Ireland gave me, but also the parties in Northern Ireland gave me. And I think, I was lucky there that, all parties allowed me enough trust to move a number of things on. And, I'm very grateful for that, because I think that did allow us to move things on. And going back to your question, I suppose the thing that I was very keen to do, one of your earlier questions, was to make sure that I was treating everybody equally. And I think by hopefully doing that, that did allow trust to develop.
Allowing trust to develop, I suppose, is one of those things that's almost impossible to measure or calibrate. What was it about, this isn't in comparison to anybody else, just from your personal experience, and you mentioned before you spent time in recruitment and in headhunting. I mean, what's your approach to developing trust with people? Is there a kind of a mechanism, a process that you have in your mind, or is it more, intuitive than that?
Well, I think, you do have to, if you are in a situation where you're trying to negotiate a deal, you do have to understand the position that everybody is coming from and try to facilitate that. Now, as you've alluded to, I'm not, or any Secretary of State, UK Secretary of State, is not totally without a view. But I think in trying to get the deal done, the rules of the Good Friday Agreement have been set out pretty clearly. I know quite a lot of the agreement has shades of grey, but it is pretty clear. And I think I really tried to adopt that and try to really understand where people were coming from.
How does that work, though? I'll push you just ever so slightly, Julian, if it's okay. In practice, is it a matter of having private conversations with people that are kind of confidential? Is it a matter of getting everybody in the room at the same time and trying to develop a relationship beyond that of politics? Is it, and I know that, and you've talked about this before, going to the pub with somebody like Simon Coveney? It just seems to me that when the history books are written about you in Northern Ireland, the word trust comes up quite a lot. And I'm interested in digging into why it is, of all the people, that you were the person who was able to earn that trust, and whether you have a recipe for achieving it. I suppose I'm just trying to extract something to use myself.
Well, I think that the experience of certainly the talks and on other matters in the last year or so was that trying to connect with people out with the formal processes, and also out with maybe some of the paradigms that had been set up over years, was quite important. So the use of the pub, they're trying to meet outside conference rooms or UK Parliament, UK government buildings, or whatever was part of that, because I guess there are from all sides worries, suspicions, etc. And what you were trying to do was to make the environment of those discussions as objective and built on good foundations. I think the other thing that was just very important during that period was how clear voters were. They were clear at the various elections during that period, but they were also clear to me personally when I met them. And I do think, essentially, whether it was the nurses' strike in December 2019, the first strike of British nurses in 103 years, or other examples, voters were clear that they wanted to be governed and they wanted their politicians back at work. And I think that gave me confidence when I was having the discussions. I wasn't having a constitutional discussion with the parties, I was having a discussion around getting government back up and running.
How do you think the election in 2019, December 2019, changed the dynamic in Northern Ireland? Looking back, do you notice that as a step change in the conversations that you were having?
Well, certainly, I think it was a wake-up call for the major parties, because you saw Alliance and SDLP, doing well there. We've seen Claire Hanna and Colm and Stephen coming into Westminster following that. It also obviously, took away the power the DUP had at Westminster through competence and supply, and that obviously focused them back on Stormont. But I'm not sure if all of those things necessarily meant that getting back into Stormont was guaranteed. I think that it was a factor. It was an important factor. But I think there were a number of other elements as well.
Did you notice, I wonder, in a more sort of direct sense, did you notice a change in the conversations that you were having? Did you, on the other side of that election, were you suddenly thinking to yourself, oh, well, I wasn't hearing that before, something has clearly changed here? Or was it a much more gradual evolution?
I think there was definitely a change, but that change was also coming from the fact that I'd made clear there would be assembly elections called on the 13th of January if they didn't agree to go back into Stormont. So we were trying to put them under pressure to get back into power. But the election, the UK election, definitely was a factor.
A difference between the deal that you proposed and were successful in putting into action and previous ones is that when you announced, and I think a lot of us who are interested in politics remember you and Simon Coveney standing in the freezing cold outside Stormont, and you announced the deal that had been knocked together by you and Coveney. But at that time, not all of the parties had signalled that they were on board with the agreement. Was that a deliberate attempt? Had you tried to get them all on board? Had the original intention be, I want all of the parties standing here and we'll announce it together? Or was the plan always that it would sort of be, and I don't mean this in a pejorative sense, bouncing them into it by announcing that this was the deal and it was do or die?
Well, you talk about the deal being sort of cobbled together by myself and Simon. In fact, it was based on a text that had been worked through with the parties for months, not just with me but with predecessors. So I think this text was very familiar to them. It was certainly, I guess, what we were seeing was, and going back to the trust issue, not a great deal of trust between the parties, particularly DUP and Sinn Féin, and there wasn't the dialogue, and maybe we'll come back to that later in relation to where we are now, but there wasn't as much direct dialogue between those major parties that I would have liked to have seen. But I think it just became apparent to Simon Coveney and I that if we didn't put this agreement to both the electorate and to the parties ourselves, you know, the five parties probably wouldn't just get there on their own. And I think that's a bit where you look at the general election. Yes, the general election made a difference, but the level of discussion between the parties was so poor at that time that I didn't, and I don't think Simon, I don't want to speak for him, but I don't think he felt we were going to get there by just standing on the sidelines.
Within that context, then, when you stood in front of the Assembly buildings and announced the deal, how much of your brain, if you had to divide it up, was confident that all the parties would be on board, that this strategy would work? And how much of your brain was thinking this is ever so slightly risky? And, you know, it could be the case that tomorrow morning, three of the parties say, no, we're not doing it. Would you be able to divide up your head? Was it 75-25, 80-20?
I think it was probably about 95% feeling that it should work, but there was always risk there. And, you know, but we had on all of the topics tried to get to a point where, you know, there was, you know, a position which was, in our view, reasonable for each of the parties. So yes, there was a chance it wasn't going to work, but I think the probabilities at that time were that it was. We didn't feel people wanted to go back to, politicians wanted to go back to face the electorate. And we've got the nurses' strike, queues of 300,000 people in Northern Ireland for waiting lists, people deeply frustrated. It was going to have to be a brave politician in any of those parties who rejected a deal which they had been involved, even though they hadn't agreed it, you know, in shaping.
Mm-hmm. Well, I suppose they had done so before, so I suppose there is still, you know, an element of risk there. The final thing I want to ask, Julian, before we sort of get to where we are and do some slightly hesitant looking back on the last number of months, is Mark Devonport, who, you know, wrote an article a few days later after the financial row that emerged after the deal was done. And for people who've blissfully forgotten, when the deal was announced, I think you'll find this fair, Julian, the impression seemed to be perhaps that there was 2 billion attached, and then 1 billion of that was money that was coming to Northern Ireland anyway. I suppose that's a fair way of putting it. Now, the article was entitled as follows: Did Julian Smith pull a fast one? So I put it to you, Julian Smith, did you pull a fast one?
Not at all. I mean, I think that we didn't really discuss money before, as you said, we hadn't concluded we hadn't got agreement from the party before we put the deal forward, and the party certainly hadn't come. They'd come with certain asks, definitely, but they had not come with, we hadn't had detailed discussions about the finances, and on point of principle, I wasn't going to do that. I mean, MLAs and political leaders have been paid for 3 years. They've been doing part of their jobs, their constituency jobs, but we weren't going to start negotiating and offering taxpayers money in order for them to get back into power. It was implicit that there would be a package, but we were not going to start putting that there up front. It was always the second reason wasn't a fast one. We were clear that there was going to be a budget that was coming up, I think, in a couple of months later in March, and as COVID has shown, there's been huge billions of pounds more put into Northern Ireland. So the whole philosophy on the financial package was we were not going to agree it up front. Whatever we put down was a down payment for the future. We have a number of important reform elements on the health service, on infrastructure, on the civil service within the New Decade, New Approach, and money was going to come down the line. It was never all going to be upfront.